I had a question from somebody, and it's one of them that I think would work good to bring up a conversation with people. They can make their recommendations. But it was from 303 Canadiana. He has, what are several vintage bikes you'd recommend to a beginner rider? Now, it's interesting, and I'm sure people have a lot of opinions on this, so we'll go through that. When you say vintage, I'm thinking really like 70s and 80s. You get much older than that, and they can be expensive, and they can be hard to get parts for. But when you get up in the 70s or mid-70s, things are still really widely available. And the good thing is, there's a lot of those bikes tucked away in people's barns or garages that for some reason or other they just quit driving. And they just sat there. And a lot of times they're glad to get rid of them. So you can get a pretty good deal on them, and usually there's very little wrong with them. For instance, I saw on Craigslist the other day, here was a 175 Honda, like a early 70s, 73 or 74, a 175 Scrambler. So it's a twin cylinder, not a bad bike, and he only wanted like 350 for it, didn't have that many miles on. Typical, like the side covers were bad, the paint was faded, stuff like that. But $350, it would have been a good deal, but it was gone by the time I was ready to go in, So, because something like that, there's always people looking for them. If nothing else, just to scrap for the parts. But a lot of times, you will run into the ones that are just sitting in barns. Like I know my brother's working on a deal on one. It's got to be maybe 80, somewhere in there. 500cc Honda Ascot. Okay, V-twin, liquid-cooled shaft drive. They only made them like 1 year. Well, it's one of the cases where, it could be a really good bike. Parts availability might be a little chancy because, like I said, they only made it 1 year. Or 2 at most. They could be a little hard to get parts for. But in theory, it sounds like a nice little bike. I'm sure they were electric start. The first Ascots were single-cylinder 500. They were electric start, which involved a whole complicated compression release mechanism to make an electric start work, and then took a big battery and a big starter, so they got to be awful heavy for what they were intended to be. And I haven't seen one of them since I was working at a Honda shop. But recommendation-wise, you can't go wrong with something like the old XL250 or 350 Hondas. You got a 4-stroke motor, pretty simple, and in a place like Canada, there should be quite a few of them around. You really want to look at something that's a dual-purpose bike, not a strictly street bike, and you don't want a strictly dirt bike. And you want to shy away from the ones that were kind of evolved from the race bikes, particularly in the 2-strokes, because a lot of times they can be just a pain in the ass to run. They got very little power down low, then they got a heck of a power band. They're fast, they're light, but they're not really fun to ride unless you're riding them hard. So as a multi-purpose bike, they're not the best. The old 2-stroke Yamahas, the DT 250s and even 360s, I think I got a couple of 360s laying around that I always intended to put the two of them together to make one bike out of them. You know, it'd be a good kind of all-purpose little putz around bike. You know, 250 is plenty big for a dirt bike. But there's again a thing where you want to keep something, you don't want to get too small. You know, so if you're going to be doing any amount of highway riding, you really got to be at least a 175. You know, like I play around with that little 125 Honda running out and getting mail and stuff, but a 20-mile trip on that would beat you to death. A 175, you're looking at a bigger machine, a bigger frame and stuff. They're a little more useful for distance. I've known people to go fairly long distances on a 175. But you want to get up there a little bit in just size of the bike. A good, like my XC500 Yamaha, the dirt version of my SR Street bike, they're a great all-purpose bike. Maybe not exactly a beginner bike, though. And they're really not a great dirt bike. They're heavy. Like a desert bike, they used them for that. But as a all-purpose run-around the street bike with the ability to go off-road sometimes, they're great. And I'm sure there's a lot of them in Canada because I bought a lot of parts out of Canada, so I know there's some up there. But they did make a scaled-down version of that in the 80s. That was a 250, an XT 250. So you got the four-stroke motor. You know, you've got all the nice stuff, and it's got enough power for your everyday use. A little chancy when you get down in the 250 range for carrying a passenger, particularly if the passenger is of any weight. You know, it's like a no-fat chicks kind of deal. You know, if you're giving a kid a ride, you know, it's fine, but you start putting two adults on a 250, it's no fun. Even two adults on my 500 is really no fun. You know, then you start looking 650 or bigger if you're going to be carrying two people. There is another option there in that Kawasaki made a KLR, and I think there's quite a few of them, and they have quite a following. And there's a lot of parts available for them. That was, well, they made them in a 650, but I think they made bigger ones too. You know, things tend to get bigger as the time goes on. But they're a very popular bike. And even Suzuki made it was like a DR, I think, that was a pretty popular bike. But really it kind of boils down to what you run across, what you can find. Because I know, like around here, you know, it used to be you could go into a motorcycle shop, there was a whole section of used motorcycles at a reasonable price. It isn't that way anymore. There really isn't many of the smaller bikes, the beginner bikes. There's these big tank things, you know, which really don't interest me. You kind of want to stay away from British because it's hard to get parts for. You know, like Husqvarna made an excellent motorcycle, two-stroke, but they're really collectible. You know, they're kind of hard to get parts for, and very much sought after. But excellent bikes. In Multaco, Montesa, there was a lot of good bikes being made. But if you stick with, you know, like the Hondas or the Yamahas, I would kind of tend to stick with the four strokes. Single cylinders, you're dealing with one spark plug, one carburetor. And plus you got the torque down low, you know, where you use it all the time. You know, that's the thing about two strokes, unless you get, you know, one that's like those old DT Yamahas, the two strokes that are purposely detuned so they've got the low end power. You know, they're a great bike. I had a DT 250 that I thought was a nice bike, and I know they made up to even a 400. You know, and good bikes. But if you want to deal with a two-stroke, they work. They're simple. They're easy to work on. You know, because you just pull that cylinder right off. But You're mixing gas and oil, and you get the pleasure to drive that a four-stroke is. So I would kind of stay with a four-stroke. But like I said, something in the 250 range would be nice as an all-purpose bike. Because you don't really want to nail yourself down to a pure street bike. You know, they've got these bikes now that they really angle toward that kind of dual sport, I guess they call them, or, you know, it's like these for taking motorcycle expeditions. You know, people used to do that on Trail 90s, you know, but now they've got these great big ones. I mean, BMW and all these make them. You know, that's not something a person really needs. But a good medium size, like 250 to 500, you know, that's a nice size to be in. And that's really where the fun on motorcycles is. You know, the bigger ones, you're pushing them. You know, they aren't fun unless you're pushing them, which gets you into trouble and gets you hurt. You know, so a nice size, you know, like I say, even you kind of got to be over 175 to get the good size frame, or, you know, and the bigger wheels and the bigger tires. But something in the 250 to 500, or even like they made the DT 400 with a two-cycle, but nice bike. But the XT 250 and the XL 250 Honda, you know, they were great bikes. But I don't run across them a lot. Like I say, they're tucked away in barns and stuff. But if you watch, that sort of thing turns up. But it's just a lucky deal, you know, what you run across. But I should work on them 360 someday. Like I say, I got two of them, and I can get parts for them. That's the good thing about the Yamahas and Hondas, is the parts availability. You know, if you need stupid things, you know, like side cover and stuff like that, in that 70s to 80s, they're pretty common. You know, they're still around. And by keeping a single cylinder, you keep the bike fairly light, makes it much easier to maintain, makes them narrower, kind of. So they're easier to ride, and if you're by getting a dual purpose bike, you get the right frame geometry that they handle really good around town, and they'll go really good off-road, or, you know, good enough off-road for cow trailing kind of stuff, and bound around on back roads. Not the best going down a highway. You know, they aren't as relaxing because of the frame geometry. You're aware of it more, you know, of the road, but that's all right, especially for a beginner. You should be aware of it. They're very controllable, but it isn't like you're going to kick back and cruise kind of thing, you know. But, you know, I see people in way too relaxed positions on motorcycles sometimes. You know, you should be alert and aware of what you're doing. And a dirt bike kind of, or a dual purpose bike kind of keeps you that way. But I would definitely stay away from anything that's too much of the motocross inspired, because they are not fun to drive unless you're really romping them, you know, but for normal driving, and a straight street bike, although they can be pretty, you know, they're not as much fun just around town even, you know. But it really boils down to what you can find, what's available. And that's where, you know, like a great bike that when I was working at the Honda shop, we sold 1 million of them, were the 350 Hondas, twins, the Scramblers and the CBs, but a lot of Scramblers. Great all-around bike. I haven't seen one of them for a long time. But they were a little more complex in that they had two cylinders. That's where that XL 250 was nice, because it was a single cylinder. You know, and they were a romping bike, you know, like when people first get them, man, they were popping wheelies and having a hell of a time with them, you know. They're a nice bike. Not terribly fast for compared to some other 250s, but I know a guy who drove one clean across the state without a problem. Well, he wore his tire out, but otherwise the bike worked fine, you know. So for limited distance traveling on a highway, they're all right. And your tire technology has gotten to the point now, with all these dual-purpose tires coming out, like those Kenda tires that I put on mine, they really last. They're a good all-purpose tire. So you could get that kind of thing. Oh, as long as I'm talking about the 5th edition tuning manual from Mikuni carburetors. This came from that vintage spoke that I talked about and from Abilene. But I run Mikuni carburetors on my motorcycles, and I've got this Mikuni, but I think I got more carburetor than I need for that. I think this is bigger than I need for that 150 Lafon motor. These are what I run on my, well, like this is a 36 Mikuni. I run a 38 on my SR, but I think I've got a 36 on my XT. They come with like a 34 or even a 32 on the XT, which is fine for low end putzing around. You really want a smaller carburetor. You don't need the bigger carburetor. But for my street bike, and especially the second SR that I have, that one I romp on, you know, so I got a 38 on that. But I thought, well, it's kind of like in reloading where you got to get the newest manual. And I thought, well, it was only like 20 bucks. You know, and it lists all the jets and the parts numbers, and that's what you a lot of times need to know for the floats and all that stuff. And it goes into the square-bodied Mikunis, which I have never had to deal with. But good to have the information. You never go wrong with information. But I'm probably going to have to buy a new Mikuni, a small one for that damn Lafon motor, because I think that's too much carburetor for what I want to use it for. But they aren't that expensive. They're a reasonably priced carburetor. I think this one, I think somebody was actually running this on a Sportster at one time. But if you don't know how to tune a Mikuni, they're infinitely adjustable. You know, you can change the slide, the profile of the slide, the needle moves up, down, the jets. You know, there's a lot of adjustability in there. And a lot of people don't really work on carburetors and don't understand, you know, that you just can't take a carburetor off one thing and put it on another and it's going to work right. It has to be adjusted. And you got to play around a lot. You know, like even on them slides, there's times where I've taken and ground on the slide with a Dremel tool to change the profile slightly to get what I was after, you know. But I'll leave the comments open on this, and if anybody else has a suggestion motorcycle-wise, which I'm sure people will, you know, we've all grown up with certain ones that we prefer and really like, you know, and had good experiences with. But I think, like I said, those Honda single cylinders or the Yamaha single cylinder 4-strokes, or if you should luck into an old DT Yamaha, they're a fine machine. You know, like I say, I had the 250 and I got rid of that one time, and it's one of them, it's like guns. If you sell a gun, you always kick yourself in the ass later for it. I kind of wish I'd hung on to that DT, you know, because it was a really nice bike. But at the time I didn't need it. But now I collect bikes that I don't need. But it'll be interesting what other people have to say on the subject. But motorcycles are fun. You know, it's nice to be able to just go out and take a little cruise.